Let's shift topics. I'd like to talk about what's been, I think, a lot of chatter amongst friends of ours who are active in the market that at a policy meeting on Wednesday, the Fed held rates steady. Jerome Powell said, quote, a reduction in our policy rate could be on the table in September if inflation continues to fall. He said, we're getting closer to the point at which it'll be appropriate to reduce our policy rate, but we're not quite at that point. The next Fed meeting where this rate cut could happen is September 17th and 18th. And if you look at the futures markets today, the market is now estimating a 20% probability of a 50 bip rate cut in the September meeting, 80% probability of a 25 bip rate cut, and basically no probability of no rate cut anymore in September. Chamath, is that your read on where we're at? And, is the Fed kind of appropriately reading the economic tea leaves, given the recessionary indicators that you just mentioned earlier, and what else we're seeing that the Fed's mandate obviously is meant to support both the monetary policy, but also employment in this country?
I think we're in a recession. And I think the problem with a recession is even as inflation diminishes, if your purchasing power is shrinking faster than prices fall, it still feels like prices are going up. I don't know if you guys have been reading the Wall Street Journal, but like the last couple of days, they've been doing a whole series on people that have been left behind by inflation. And I was really surprised as I read those articles, just the sheer quantity of impact in terms of the number of people it's touching independent of salary. And so my takeaway kind of just reinforced the fact that we've sort of like looked past the problem because of the stock market going up for the last few quarters because of 7 companies. And now that people are sobering up to the reality that even they don't have an answer for all the money they're spending, the stock market's down next to those 7 businesses. And I think that you're going to start to see some real pain in the fall. So Jerome Powell is probably going to cut 25 and I think that if they get to him, he'll try to cut 50. But the problem is it won't solve the problem. And I think if this is, again, where Kamala Harris has to be, she's going to have to make a very difficult calculation here, which is she's going to have to throw Joe Biden and the economic team in the White House under the bus here and say, that was them. Yes, they screwed it up. It was against my wishes. And here's my vision for how we fix this, because otherwise the Republicans will be all over it. And I think if you have a bad economy, like what it looks like going into November, it's going to be very difficult for the Democrats to win the White House.
Well, without bringing it back to politics, Sachs, economy good or bad? And is Jerome Powell going to cut rates 25 bips, 50 bips? Do you agree with what the market's forecasting?
I guess what I would say about the economy is that in nominal terms, we're not in a recession according to the data that's come out. The Q2 GDP was roughly 2% GDP growth. However, I think there's a couple of problems. One is that what we've seen over the past year or so is that the economic data that comes out keeps getting reforecast down. So they put out a provisional number or an estimate, and then when they finalize the number 3 months or 6 months later, it always seems to go in one direction. We've seen this over and over again with new jobs being reforecast down. And we saw this with the Q1 GDP, where initially they were reporting, I think it was like a 1.8% number, and then it got restated down to 1.3%. So the Q2 GDP number was around 2%. It was good, but again, it's a provisional number, and let's see where it actually ends up. The bigger problem is government spending. The deficit is running at 6% of GDP, whereas economic growth is at, let's call it charitably 2%. Well, government spending is included in GDP. So if you were to balance the budget, let's say that you were to make government live within its means and not have a deficit, we would have negative 4% GDP growth. So the only reason why we're in positive GDP growth territory is because of massive government spending that we know is not sustainable. And at some point, the bill is going to come due for that. So I'd have to say that, you asked me, is this a good economy? I mean, it's not the worst, but there's definitely unsustainable things propping it up. And I do think that the bill will come due at some point for this.
It's not just fully supported, it's overly supported by the federal government in the United States. And I mentioned this last week. Federal government spending is over 2x the sum of all state spending. Federal government spending into next year with the Biden budget proposal, $7.3 trillion. That's like 30% of GDP. And I think you guys may remember this analysis I pulled together a couple months ago, where I estimate something close to 30% of US employment is either direct government employment or indirect government employment through government payments to third parties that are employing those individuals. So the government is becoming an integral part of maintaining the flow of dollars in the economy because they are such an integral buyer and seller within the economy and an integral employer within the economy. And so to reverse that trend is what I worry about more than anything, as I've shared many times, which is why I question whether either political candidate actually solves this problem for us. And we're almost like, arguing over which marbles I get while the Titanic is sinking, that there is a real fundamental issue with how this economy is structured. I will tell you anecdotally, I have a lot of conversations with folks that work in the agriculture industry, in the food industry, in the industrial industry, many of these industries that have a very different capital flow cycle than we all deal with typically in Silicon Valley and software. And many of them are struggling. I mean, these are businesses where some folks have told me orders completely fell off a cliff in capital equipment, that some small business owners that sell whatever piece of equipment you want to come up with, they are not getting orders. There's no revenue. There are massive oversupply and underpurchasing happening in the food and ag markets. And yet folks are still trying to push up prices in order to make the debt payments that they have to make on their high interest debt now. And that creates a crippling condition for them. Across the economy, I think there's the haves and the have-nots, as is indicated in this article that was just pulled up, where there are some parts of the economy where you have low debt, high margin businesses that can continue to scale and continue to raise pricing, have a lot of elasticity in pricing. And then there are the others that operate on, 1% interest rate changes drive their profit or loss for the year in a pretty meaningful way. And that's the part of the economy that's really suffering. And unfortunately, the action that will be taken to resolve this isn't necessarily a free market action. It's going to end up being some sort of government intervention, which furthers the government's involvement in the economy and furthers the tentacles that make it much harder to ultimately pull out of this spiral and this problem. That's my rant on this whole point. But
yeah, no, I agree with that. I agree with all that. I've seen some reports that a crazy percentage of the job creation over the past year have been government jobs.
All of it, and more than 100%. So basically, there has been a net loss in private market jobs, net of the effect of government employment or government spending on companies that then use those dollars to go hire people.